The wind scraped across the ranch like a restless warning. She stood near the old wooden bed, hands clenched into her shawl, eyes darting anywhere but at him. The rancher's boots stopped just a few feet away. He was a man of few words, known for silence heavier than most people's anger. Please. Her voice cracked, barely louder than the creak of the house. Please don't. He paused, brow tightening. He thought it was fear. He had seen fear before. Life had taught him how to recognize it. But this was different. Her hands trembled, not just with panic, but with something buried deeper. When he stepped closer, she flinched as if bracing for something far worse than his presence. Stop, she whispered. You don't understand. That was when he noticed it. The scar at her wrist. Not an accident. Not old ranch work. Something deliberate. Something done to her. His hand dropped to his side. The room went silent. And for the first time in years, the rancher felt uncertainty crawl up his spine. The rancher stepped back, distance suddenly feeling necessary. Talk, he said quietly. Not a command. A request. She sank onto the edge of the bed, shoulders folding inward like she'd been carrying this weight for too long. Words spilled out in fragments. A past she had buried. A promise she had been forced into. A life sold off piece by piece long before she ever arrived at the ranch. She hadn't come willingly. The contract he believed was legal, clean, final. It wasn't. Names were mentioned, men he vaguely remembered from town, deals whispered over drinks, paperwork that hid cruelty behind ink and signature. You were never supposed to know, she said, tears tracing paths she no longer tried to hide. If you knew, everything would fall apart. The rancher's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists. He realized then the truth wasn't about her fear. It was about his role in something he never agreed to be part of. And once a man like him sees the truth, there's no turning away. Morning broke over the ranch, painting the fields gold, but nothing felt warm. The rancher stood outside, staring at the horizon, replaying every moment, every assumption, every silence he had mistaken for consent. Inside she waited, not knowing if she would be sent away or worse. Instead, he returned with a coat and placed it gently over her shoulders. No one touches you, he said firmly. Gone now. Not ever. By noon, he was riding into town. By nightfall, doors were being knocked on, names dragged into the open, deals unraveled. Men who thought themselves untouchable suddenly felt the ground shift beneath them. The rancher didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he came back, exhausted and bruised by the weight of what he'd done, she looked at him with disbelief. He met her gaze steady, certain. Yes, he replied, or did, because some truths freeze a man in place and others force him to move no matter the cost. The wind moved through the ranch house like it had a purpose, slipping through loose boards and rattling the window panes as if it knew something was about to break. She stood near the foot of the old wooden bed, fingers knotted in the fabric of her shawl, shoulders drawn tight. The lamplight caught the pale strain in her face, the way her breath came shallow and uneven. When the rancher stepped closer, his boots sounded too loud on the floor, each step echoing more than it should have. Please, she said, the word barely holding together. Her eyes stayed fixed on the wall behind him, as if looking at his face might undo her. Please, don't. He stopped, confused more than angry. He had mistaken her silence for agreement, her stillness for acceptance. That was how things worked in his world. People spoke when they objected. They stood firm when they meant no. Yet here she was shaking, as if every muscle in her body was trying to flee without her. Why? He asked, his voice rough but not raised. She swallowed hard. Her hands came up between them, not to touch him, but to shield herself, a reflex carved into her bones. Up close, he noticed details he had ignored before. The faint bruising along her forearm, the way she flinched when his shadow crossed her. And then he saw it clearly. A thin, angry scar circling her wrist, too precise to be an accident, too cruel to be chance. His breath caught. His hand, which had been reaching out, fell back to his side. That scar told a story he didn't want to hear, but couldn't ignore. I didn't choose this, she whispered, tears finally breaking free. I was told I had no choice. The room felt smaller then, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. The rancher felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, heavy and cold. The certainty he'd carried into the room cracked, splitting under the weight of what he was beginning to understand. He took a step back, giving her space, giving himself a moment to breathe. Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside, everything went still. And in that stillness, the rancher realized this was not fear asking him to stop. It was truth. The rancher took another step back, as if the air between them had turned sharp. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, eyes never leaving her face. "But a talk," he said quietly, the word stripped of command, weighed down by something closer to need. The room no longer felt like his. It felt borrowed, like a place where something wrong had been hiding in plain sight. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, movements careful, as though sudden motion might bring punishment. For a long moment she said nothing. Then the silence broke in pieces. A promise made on her behalf. Papers signed by hands that were not hers. Men who spoke kindly while closing doors. She told him how she had been passed along as a solution to someone else's problem, how obedience had been framed as gratitude. Each sentence seemed to cost her more breath than the last. The rancher listened, jaw clenched so tight it ached. The contract he remembered, the one he had barely read, took on a different shape in his mind. He had believed it clean, a mutual agreement. Now it sounded like a trap dressed up as opportunity. Names surfaced, familiar ones. A merchant from town. A man who drank at the far end of the saloon. Faces that suddenly felt heavier with guilt. "They said you were decent," she murmured, staring at her hands. "They said you wouldn't ask questions." The words landed hard. He turned away, pacing once across the room, boots scraping against the floor. Decent. The word mocked him. He had built his life on fairness, on never taking more than was offered. Yet here he stood, realizing how easily silence could be mistaken for consent when it suited a man. He stopped near the window, fists clenched, staring out at the dark fields. Anger rose, not sharp, but deep and steady. Not at her, at himself, at the men who had counted on his ignorance, at a system that hid cruelty behind ink and polite conversation. "When did this happen?" he asked, voice low. "All my life," she replied. The answer froze him. He turned back slowly, meeting her eyes at last. In them he saw not deception, but exhaustion. A person worn thin by survival. The truth settled fully then, heavy and undeniable. Whatever he thought he had agreed to, it was built on a lie. And once a man sees that kind of truth, he can never unknow. Morning crept over the ranch in pale bands of light, touching the fields without warmth. The rancher stood outside the house long before the sun fully rose, hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't slept. Every sound of the night had felt too loud, every memory too sharp. He replayed her words again and again, seeing past moments with new clarity, realizing how many signs he had chosen not to read. Inside the house, she sat quietly at the table, unsure of what the day would bring. She had learned not to expect mercy. It had finally set her in motion. The trouble did not arrive loudly. It came the way it always did, disguised as routine. A wagon rolled up the long dirt road just past noon, its wheels grinding slowly, deliberately, as if announcing patience rather than threat. She saw it first from the porch and felt the old tightening in her chest, the instinct to disappear. The rancher noticed the change in her posture before he saw the wagon itself. Two men climbed down when it stopped. Clean coats, polite smiles stretched too thin. They carried papers, the kind that once decided everything for her. One of them tipped his hat, eyes already scanning the property as if measuring ownership. "We're here to clear up a misunderstanding," the taller one said smoothly. "She's legally bound elsewhere." The rancher stepped forward, placing himself between them and the house without a word. He took the papers when they were offered, read them slowly, then folded them once and handed them back. "Those documents were built on coercion," he said. "They don't hold." The men exchanged glances. The shorter one chuckled. "That's not for you to decide." "It is when it happens on my land," the rancher replied. She stood frozen, watching the moment stretch. Fear whispered that this was where protection ended, where power reminded her of its reach. But the rancher did not move aside. His stillness was firmer than shouting. Around them, the ranch seemed to lean in, the horses restless, the wind lifting dust at their feet. "All are making this difficult," the taller man said. "No," the rancher answered. "You did." The smiles vanished. Words sharpened. Threats were hinted at but never spoken outright. Finally, with nothing left to press, the men climbed back into their wagon, promises of return hanging in the air like smoke. The road swallowed them again, leaving only silence behind. Her knees nearly gave out. She sat heavily on the porch steps, breath unsteady. The rancher knelt nearby, not touching her, just present. "They'll try again," she said quietly. "Maybe," he replied, "but not today." Something shifted then, subtle but lasting. She realized the danger was real, but so was the stand he had taken. The past had reached for her and been refused. As the dust settled, she felt the fear loosen its grip. Not gone, just smaller. For the first time, resistance did not feel like a mistake, felt like the beginning of ownership over her own life. The night after the men left, sleep came in broken pieces. She drifted in and out of it like someone learning to swim in deep water, never fully trusting the surface to hold. Every sound tugged her awake, the creak of the house settling, the distant stamp of a horse. Even the wind, which once felt like a warning, now felt like a question she did not yet know how to answer. When morning finally arrived, it did not bring clarity only. Days turned into weeks, and with them came consequences that could not be ridden away from or argued down in a single conversation. Word spread, not just about her, but about the rancher. Some people spoke his name with respect, others with irritation sharpened by inconvenience. He had disrupted something smooth and profitable, and systems like that rarely forgave easily. Letters arrived. Some formal, some threatening, most pretending to be reasonable. He read them all, then locked them away, refusing to let their poison leak into the house. She watched him closely during that time, trying to understand the shape of a man who would choose discomfort over ease. He did not dramatize his actions. He still rose before dawn, still tended the land, still spoke sparingly. But there was a new steadiness to him, as if making one hard choice had anchored all the others. She wondered if he understood what it meant to her, or if he simply believed this was what any decent person should do. Slowly, he began to invite her into the life of the ranch, not as obligation, but as option. It waited. When the final decision came down, it was quieter than she expected. No dramatic reckoning, no sweeping justice, just accountability, partial and imperfect, enough to matter, enough to change the shape of things going forward. She felt neither triumphant nor empty, just solid. The truth had taken much from her, but it had also given something back. A self that was no longer negotiated away. A future that was not signed over by someone else's hand. As night settled over the ranch, she stood alone in the open field, breathing in the dark. She did not know exactly where her life would lead, but she knew this much with certainty. She would never again beg to be allowed to stop, and no one would ever freeze her in place by denying her truth.